Hello, friends. Welcome to the Bibi Farber Show. As smooth and civilized as Jack Daniel's whiskey and with just as much kick, Bibi Farber is one of America's most revered and legendary broadcasters. Bibi Farber is considered the father of the modern American radio talk show. As an author, his bylines have appeared in the New York Times, Reader's Digest, the Washington Post, and the Saturday Review. Bibi is a student of over 25 languages. Talkers Magazine ranked him in the top 10 of greatest radio talk show hosts of all time. And Mr. Farber is an inductee to the Radio Hall of Fame. Broadcasting daily coast to coast and around the world on CRN Digital Talk Radio, Bibi Farber brings a thoughtful and nuanced perspective to all the day's pertinent issues. Here's what Fox News' Sean Hannity had to say about his good friend, Bibi Farber.
Hannity-ism. Part 1, Bibi Farber. There's never been a country in the history of man that's accumulated more power and abused it less, and used that power for the advancement of the human condition worldwide.
And now, live from New York City, here's Bibi Farber.
It may well be that my partner across the microphones right now is the most interesting person I've ever met. He may be the most interesting person anybody has ever met. It is altogether possible that billionaire Craig Winn is the most interesting person in the world. After his firm was sold and his pockets were bulging and he became a billionaire, he decided to withdraw and do what he had always wanted to do: give us a legitimate, trustworthy interpretation, translation of the Bible, the entire thing. What a goal. Mr. Winn, what propelled you to that magnificent madness?
Well, hi, Barry. First, I think the only reason that I might be among, if not the most interesting person in the world, is only based upon what I have learned, not so much what I have done. But what I had done some time ago, right after 9/11, I knew George Bush personally. Didn't like him very much. Didn't respect him, I should say, very much. Fairly likable guy. He's just not a guy that you would respect. And he had told me that he wanted to be a wartime president. So I knew exactly what he was going to do after 9/11, and I knew it was going to be a disaster for America. So when I failed to get a meeting with him right after 9/11, I went off and met with al-Qaeda. I think I'm the only American to have met with al-Qaeda and survived the meeting. And it sounds like a long story to lead to why would I translate the Dead Sea Scrolls out of Paleo-Hebrew into English. But as I asked al-Qaeda and other Islamic terrorist members why they flew planes into our buildings and why they thought that terror was an appropriate tactic, they kept on citing their Quran and Hadith. The Hadith are all reports from Muhammad. And so after listening to them tell me why they had done so for about 5 or 6 hours at gunpoint, unfortunately they were holding the guns on me, not the other way around, I was devoted to ascertaining whether or not the Islamic terrorists had corrupted their religion or if their religion had corrupted them. I thought it was the single most important question that we could ask following 9/11. So I spent the next 3 or 4 years studying Islam. I think my book, Prophet of Doom, is the first ever to rearrange the Quran chronologically and set it into the context of Muhammad's life using the Hadith. And as I was writing that book, and it's available free, I'm not trying to sell anything. If you want to understand the nature of Islam, I would encourage you and any of your readers to go online, prophetofdoom.net. It's available in its entirety for free. But the Quran constantly claims that it confirms the Torah, when I knew that it was the opposite. But knowing it's the opposite and proving it's the opposite are two different things. So I began to study the Torah, and as I did so in English translations, I immediately discovered that our English translations are horribly errant. They're not even close to what the underlying Hebrew says, and they're even further away from the oldest manuscripts, which would be the Dead Sea Scrolls. So after running up against passage after passage that I knew was not translated correctly, I took the time to learn to read Paleo-Hebrew, and I've translated now 20 different books, averaging about 1,000 pages apiece.
Stay right there. Stay right there, Mr. Winn. We'll be right back and pick you up at that intersection after a very short commercial break. I told you he was the most interesting man I had ever met. I'm Bibi Farber, and I have long wondered since I was a little boy if the Dead Sea Scrolls were accurately translated. We now have our answer from the horse's mouth, from the whole animal kingdom. Craig Winn has done it himself, learned Hebrew, retranslated the Dead Sea Scrolls. And where does that leave us? Where does that leave our religions? Where does it leave Christianity, Judaism, Islam? But before any of that, how in the world did you get interviews with Al-Qaeda and Hamas?
Oh, that's a
Islamic Jihad? How did you do that? And also the Israeli Shin Bet and the Israeli Mossad. How did you do that?
Yeah, the last question is easy to answer, and I'm not sure all of that important, but I was once a billionaire, and when you have that kind of money, you have access. And so I was one of the few people with access that decided to use it. And so I risked my life to learn why Muslims flew planes into our buildings and why 99% of the world's terrorist acts are perpetrated by fundamentalist Muslims. So I knew Knesset members. I knew Mossad agents. And when I flew to Israel to begin that journey, I was greeted at the airport by Mossad agents and taken directly to the Knesset and met with the Prime Minister's cabinet. And it took 2 weeks of negotiation and finally signing documents that said that the Israeli government would do as I had requested and introduce me to members of each of the Islamic terrorist groups that I had asked to interview, but that they would absolve themselves of all responsibility and that they thought that the likelihood of me surviving what I was asking to do was nil. But that's really not the interesting part. It's your first question is the interesting part, Barry. By correctly translating the oldest copies of what Yahweh, which is God's one and only name, had to say, the religions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam were destroyed. The God who inspired those books proves his existence. He validates his name. He very clearly says what he wants and what he detests. Politics and religion are things that he detests. And he very clearly says, this is what I want. And what he wants and what he detests literally destroy all of the credibility of Christianity and of rabbinic Judaism. You know, from a Christian point of view, what Christians don't realize is that the man that inspired or wrote half of their New Testament was a complete and utter fraud. Maybe, in fact, from God's perspective, he calls him the plague of death. But Paul, whose real name was Shaul, from God's perspective, and he has many, many prophecies regarding Paul, even calls him out by name, and labels him as the worst human being to ever live.
How in the world can we know God? Can God be knowable? Does he have a name?
Absolutely. And that was the first thing that I learned by translating the Hebrew text out of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that faith is absolutely useless, that you do not need faith. God can absolutely, unquestionably be known. And I went into this. I was an evangelical Christian and then turned agnostic. I turned agnostic because there's some 20 questions that I could pose to any Christian theologian or scholar they can't answer. And just evidence and reason told me I can't continue to be a Christian because the religion makes no sense. Little things like, for example, how does man kill God? The Christians want to blame Jews for killing their God, and if Jews killed their God, and it wasn't Jews, it happened to be Romans that killed Yahweh, which was his real name, not Jesus, then they ought to be worshiping the Jews. But, there's at least 20 questions that you cannot answer if you're a Christian. So I went and I became an agnostic. And I'm not an agnostic now. I know Yahweh. He is eminently knowable. He presents himself in such a way that he proves his existence, and he does so through prophecy. But prophecy, Barry, isn't just him predicting future events in our past and having them written down so that we can verify that he said these things precisely long before they occurred. And that's the beauty of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They predate many of the events that they predict by anywhere from 250 to 2,000 years. Is that prophecy is also history. It's the Hebrew language is liberated in time. The verbs are not past, present, and future. And so the language itself works very much like light. And if you're familiar with Einstein, he would tell you that the more a being becomes like light, the more they can see the past, present, and future and experience them all simultaneously. So what the oldest manuscripts of the Torah, the prophets, and Psalms reveal is that the Spirit that inspired them not only witnessed our distant past, including creation, and I'll share an insight with you on creation in a moment that I think will blow your way, but he also witnessed our future and reported in our past what would transpire in our future. So there are tens of thousands of very precise revelations, both past and present, that are precisely accurate, that prove that the Spirit that inspired the Hebrew text of the Torah, prophets, and Psalms exists outside of the confines of time and was, in fact, the creator of the universe. So, yes, God can be absolutely known. And he tells us a lot about himself, including his name, which is Yahweh, throughout his text. And he even says, here's the 5 things that you ought to do if you want to be part of my family and live forever. And if you don't wish to do these things, then here are the consequences.
How accurate is the story of creation?
Well, Barry, the most interesting part of the creation account is as follows. You've, I'm sure, read it, and you know that the God that inspired it says that he spoke the universe into existence, beginning with light, and that he did so in 6 24-hour days. On the 7th day, he enjoyed what he had created. But you might say, well, that's not possible because, of course, the universe is somewhere between 13.7 and 15 billion years old, and I put the range in because we don't know how much time transpired before quarks were confined and energy became matter, because in a universe that is pure energy, pure light, time doesn't flow. Time only begins to flow when quarks are confined and we transition from energy to matter. That occurred sometime between 13.7 and 15 billion years ago. We have the Wilkinson microwave probe that has measured the actual temperature and the stretching of time at the Big Bang. Big Bang, by the way, is a term that Yahweh uses in his creation account. And what the microwave probe and the microwave background radiation shows is that in the presence of the great energy and mass and matter and velocity of creation, time was slowed relative to our experience by 10 to the 12th power. I'm sure you're aware that if you were on a rocket ship going at half the speed of light and you were sailing out of our solar system, you would find yourself experiencing 1 year while those on Earth might experience 100 years. Well, that's how the difference in time. If you were to take creation and divide it by 10 to the 12th power, the time was extended. You have 6 24-hour days.
Stay right there. Stay right there. All leaves have been canceled. Look what's going on in this studio. Wow. When does an interview with a billionaire pay no attention at all to how that money was made? Well, that happens very, very rarely. Maybe this is the only time. when what the billionaire has learned is, as he put it himself, paramount, more important than what it is that anything he or anybody else might have done. Craig, if I'm remembering correctly, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in a cave by a Jordanian shepherd boy. Am I on target?
Correct, yeah, in the 1950s. And then after it was discovered, between the Jordanians who had control, the West Bank was once part of Jordan, between them, they had political and geographic control, and then the Roman Catholic Church asserted its control because it had huge influence in Israel at the time. And between the two, the last thing they wanted was those scrolls being made available to anyone to study them. And so for the next 30 years, it was this giant cover-up, and no one was given access outside of those two organizations to the scrolls, and the last thing they wanted was them revealed. And it was actually a very clever gentleman that figured out the code they were using just to classify the text, that was able to revert that code into the actual text that was on these documents. And once the cat was out of the bag and they were shamed, gradually over the next 20 years, the scrolls were revealed by photograph. And today there are a number of very effective tools that you can use. There's what's called the Dead Sea Scroll Bible. The translation is worthless in it, but what it does is it italicizes every word that is different than the Masoretic text. And so you can use the Masoretic text up to the point of the difference and then go to the actual photograph of that word in the scroll that is changed and make the correction. But there's also probably 50 sites today that publish pictures of the parchments that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written on. So if you're willing to learn the old alphabet and you're willing to ignore the Masoretic diacritical markings and return to the language as it once existed, they can be translated directly from those parchments. The difficulty for a lot of people is that they trust the Masoretic, and the problem with doing so is that the Masoretes in about 1100 CE came up with a system they called shav, which actually means to confuse and to corrupt. Who knows why it's pretty blatant to have named it that way. But that system was designed to create pronunciation of an alphabet that they claimed had no vowels. But that's nonsense. The Hebrew alphabet's 22 letters. 5 of the 22 letters are vowels. And all you have to do is look at how the words that are commonly spoken are pronounced, and you can recognize the pronunciation of the vowels. A great example would be the most common word that Jews pronounce today is shalom. And the O sound from shalom is from the Hebrew wah. The Torah may be the second most commonly pronounced Hebrew word. The O from in Torah is from the Hebrew wah. The ah sound at the end of Torah is from the hey. And so those are two of the 4 letters in Yahweh's name, and the hey is repeated twice. And the only thing you add is the yod, which is the y, which is pronounced the same way it is in English. So it's Yahowah. Very easy to pronounce every name and every word simply by recognizing the most popular words and working backwards to ascertain common pronunciations.
What do we learn in your work about the relationship between Yahweh and Abraham?
Yeah, Yahweh and Abraham had a marvelous relationship. It's one. I think it's the third really important relationship that he develops. And the thing that's so magnificent about it is that the bulk, about 2/3 of the book of Bereshith, Genesis, is devoted to Yahweh establishing a relationship with Abraham. And that relationship is the basis of the covenant. So what you find by studying it is that there were 5 conditions that Yahweh asked of Abraham, 5 specific things that he asked of Abraham that Abraham had to act upon and agree to to be part of the covenant. And then Yahweh provided Abraham with 5 specific benefits that he would receive if he accepted the terms of the covenant. So, love to share with you what I learned in terms of what are those 5 conditions and what are the 5 benefits of the covenant, because it's the only way to establish a relationship with Yahweh.
When we get back together, that is your assignment. Give us the 5 cardinal points that we have learned and would not know about if you had not turned your attention to this fantastic pursuit. We'll be right back with Craig Winn, billionaire scholar. It is no mystery that somebody who learns Hebrew to translate the Dead Sea Scrolls and really turn on the lights inside the major Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, for the very first time, in a way that's better than being a billionaire. But of course, we all know that being a billionaire has its attractions too. Craig, can you give us the 5 cardinal points that you referred to just before the break?
Yeah, I'd like to just touch on something 2 segments ago and then make a clarification if I might as well. I'm not sure they really sunk in well because we were right at the end of the segment. But when you recognize that the creation account is told from the perspective of the Creator at creation, and we know exactly how slowly time flowed compared to the way time flows here on Earth, that 6 24-hour days and 15 billion years are exactly the same amount of time. If you divide 15 billion years by 10 to the 12th power, which is the evidence from the microwave radiation from the Big Bang, you end up at 6 24-hour days exactly. And that is mind-boggling in terms of its implications. Now, the clarification I want to make is there's no such thing as an Abrahamic faith. I know the term is tossed around by Muslims, by Jews, and by Christians. Abraham didn't have any faith. I don't have any faith. Abraham knew Yahweh. I know Yahweh. There is no reason for faith. Faith is what one does when one doesn't know. It's a substitute for knowing. If you know, you don't need to believe. If you know, there's no reason for faith. You only have faith if you do not know. And Yahweh presents himself in a way that he can be known. Now, the other thing that I would say is that Christianity has absolutely no relationship whatsoever to the covenant that Yahweh established with Abraham. Christianity, based on Paul's writings, claims that there's this new covenant or New Testament. And in Galatians, Paul actually writes about the fact that the covenant that was established on Mount Sinai, which would be the Torah's covenant, the covenant with Abraham, he says that it was with Hagar and it enslaves, right in the middle of Galatians. In fact, it was when I was translating that out of the oldest Greek manuscripts that I said, I need to go back and look at everything Paul said, because that's an outright lie, and perhaps everything the man said is a lie, and that's what I learned. And of course, Islam is the antithesis of God. Allah, it models himself after Satan. Islam is not only the dumbest religion ever conceived, it is also the most deadly and vile. There is no correlation whatsoever between Abraham and Islam. And in Judaism, of course, the problem with rabbinic Judaism is this false claim that the Talmud, being the oral law, was somehow provided at the same time, and that the religion is based upon this myth of an oral law being provided to the elders and passed down through the centuries orally. And Yahweh says that's absolute nonsense. So there is no correlation between the religions and what God says to Abraham and of Abraham in the covenant presentation. Now, for your listeners that they wish to read about any of this, the books Yada Yah, in fact, this is in volume 1, Yada Yah, Y-A-D-A, which means to know, Yah, which is the familial form of Yahweh's name. YadaYah.com is the site that presents everything that we have talked about thus far. It is free. I don't make a nickel on it. And if somebody wants a hardback printed book, They can buy it yada yada at Volume 1 at Amazon. All you'd be paying is the actual printing cost. I get no royalties. There's a reason for that. To try to profit based upon what I have learned by translating God's testimony would be absurd. It's his testimony. I don't have any claim to any of it. My only involvement was I devoted the time to more accurately and more completely translate the oldest text of what he had to say. All right, so the 5 conditions of the covenant are: the first thing you have to do is walk away from your country and from your religion. In Abraham's case, he had to walk away from Babylon. As a matter of fact, Yahweh was still calling his people out of Babel. Come out of her, my people, is his last message prophetically to his children, the children of Israel. Come out of Babel. Babylon is the birthplace of both religion and politics. And so Yahweh says, we're not going to even engage in a discussion about a relationship until you walk away and disassociate yourself from religion and politics, from the customs of your family, from your society and culture. So what that says is that if you are religious, you have no chance of knowing God. You have no chance of being saved by him. You have no chance of developing a relationship with him. There's not a single religious person who has ever been invited into heaven and never will be. The initial requirement to be part of the covenant is to disassociate from religion and politics.
Wow.
The next statement is God says, walk to me and become perfect. Now, God's not expecting us to be perfect. We're incapable of it. In fact, Yahweh's favorite person in all of history, his Messiah, his beloved son, is David. I'm sure that shocked will shock a lot of your listeners, Barry, but the Messiah is David. He was a Mashiach 3 times. Yosha, the Christian Jesus, was never anointed or a Mashiach. And he was a very flawed individual. So God isn't saying that we have to be perfect, but that he's going to make us perfect. And he has a 7-step plan for making us perfect. They are the 7 Moed Mikre. And the 7 Moed Mikre begin with Pesach, which is the doorway to life, Matzah, which is unyeasted bread, which is the means to perfection. It's the means to eliminate the fungus of religion and politics, leading to Bokurim, which is firstborn children, and then Shabuah, which is enrichment and empowerment, to Teruah, which is to share this message, both the negative nature of religion and the positive nature of the covenant, which leads to reconciliations, Kapurim, and then to Sukkah, which were shelters, which we're currently celebrating this year. So God says, walk along that path to me and become perfect. And that path is how he makes us appear perfect in his eyes. The third step to the covenant is God says, I want you to trust and rely upon me. Now, to trust and rely, Barry, one has to know. One has to understand, or you can't trust and rely. He didn't say believe in me, where you don't have to know anything. He said trust and rely upon me. And the only way...
Stay there, everybody. Nobody moves. Stay right there. We'll be right back after a medley of selected business announcements, and I'm going to want to know, after we finish the covenant coverage, what was before God? My head is a palpitating temple now, being torn down by knowledge. Imagine, I just imagine every church, every synagogue, every Islamic center is exploding. They took direct hits from one man who made it his mission to get to the bottom of things, not through translation, but by his own sweat and knowledge, which he acquired, learned Hebrew, retranslated the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this leaves us, well, I don't know where it does leave us. Maybe there'll be time to find out, but meanwhile, let's get right back to the 5 points. I think we were about to embark on number 4.
We are indeed. And the fourth is to observe. The Hebrew word is shamar. It is one of the most important verbs in the entire Hebrew lexicon. There's this notion, if you read an English translation, that you're supposed to obey laws and keep commandments. Now, what's interesting, there isn't a single commandment. In fact, the most recent book I wrote was on the 10 statements that Yah etched in stone, and there's not one commandment among them. And God doesn't even have a word for obey. The word that is rendered obey is from shama, which means to listen, and the word that is rendered keep is from shamar, which means to closely examine and carefully consider, to use your eyes to read things and then process what you're reading in your mind, shamar. And so God says, I want you to closely examine and carefully consider the terms and conditions of my covenant. I want you to understand that there are 5 conditions and 5 benefits so that you're in a position that once you know about them, you can exercise free will and determine whether or not you want to have a relationship with me, you like who I am, you accept my terms and conditions, you would find the benefits that I'm providing enjoyable. And based upon knowing the terms and conditions, observing the terms and conditions of the covenant, then we can make an informed decision. The 5th condition of the covenant is that all men must be circumcised. If you are an uncircumcised male, you cannot participate in Passover, which means there's no eternal life. You cannot engage in the covenant. Circumcision, not spiritual circumcision, actual circumcision is a requirement, and it's the sign of the covenant. It's a very specific sign that's based upon the word karat, which means to cut, to separate, so that we understand that to be part of God's family, we have to be separate from the family of man. We can choose to trust and rely and engage with the family of man, or we can choose to be part of God's family, and which will sever many of those relationships, because we can't be political, we can't be religious if we're going to be part of God's family. So those are the 5 conditions. There are then 5 benefits, and the benefits were all provided by what Yahweh did in year 4000 Yah, which was 33 CE. First is eternal life. That's based upon Passover. It's the doorway to life. But Passover, if you were, say, for example, a Christian, you actually celebrated Passover, which is the day that Yosheb became the Passover lamb, and you understood what that means, and you didn't celebrate matzah, it would be counterproductive, because you would become immortal, but still flawed and therefore separated from God. So you always want to celebrate Pesach with matzah, because matzah is the removal of the fungus of yeast, which is symbolic of religious and political sin from our souls. So that the third step along this way, after perfection, so eternal life perfection, is to be adopted. And that is Bakurim. It means firstborn children, and we're adopted into Yahweh's family, the covenant family. The next 2 benefits of the covenant are provided by Shavuah, which is the promise of 7, where we're enriched and we're empowered. We are literally transported and transitioned, if you will, from being material beings to being eternal beings based upon energy, with all of the advantages thereupon. And we also gain access because of this empowerment to an existence within 7 dimensions. Our universe is 3.5, and our existence is 3.5. Our universe is 6. Yahweh's in the 7th, and Shavuah empowers us to be able to accomplish that incredible. It's infinity times infinity 4 times to be greater than we currently are, and those are the benefits of the covenant.
Do we have any clue in anything that you have perused, considered carefully, is there any indication of what preceded God and what gave us God, what prompted God?
Yeah, God's an infinite being in time. He's like the Hebrew language, and like light, it simply exists. So the only reasonable scenario that you can ascertain as you read the creation account is that Yahweh is a 7-dimensional being, and therefore and therefore calling a six-dimensional universe into existence was an extraordinarily easy thing for him to do. Kind of like Walt Disney deciding to create a two-dimensional realm for Mickey and Minnie Mouse. Very easy for him to do, but then impossible for Minnie and Mickey Mouse to actually fathom the three-dimensional universe of their creator. So Yahweh existed in seven dimensions. His purpose for creating us is he could not continue to be infinite unless he engaged in a relationship that was based upon free will. It's the advantages and the benefits of being a father, of enjoying a family and a relationship that enables him to continue to grow and to be infinite.
I wish we could go on indefinitely, but we can go on a little bit more. We'll be right back with Craig Winn. Craig Winn, what reaction have you met from those whose very livelihoods depend on religion?
Yeah, 100% of those who have read the books. For example, I wrote a book called Questioning Paul, based upon actually translating the earliest manuscripts of his letters out of Greek into English, and then compared it to what Yahweh said. 100% of those who have read Questioning Paul are no longer Christians. 100%. There's not a single person who has read Questioning Paul. I don't think it can be done and remain a Christian. Of those who have read Yada Yah, 100% of those who have taken the time to read Yada Yah, which is 7 volumes, we've just really talked about the first volume, they've come to know Yahweh, and they have walked away from their religion. That doesn't mean that what I'm saying is going to have a positive influence on everyone. It isn't. 99% of people, it will have no influence other than to make them angry. An overtly religious person, Barry, an overtly political person is incapable of following evidence and reason. If you tell an overtly religious person that their faith is false, and you can prove it over and over again, 1,000 times over, rather than thank you for destroying something that was leading them astray, and for pointing them in the right direction, all they're going to do is get mad at you, and they're not able to even process evidence and reason. So I will tell you that universally religious people just reject it out of hand because they won't read it and they can't even consider it. And the same thing is true with, and I don't know how much you have to engage with this, but we've moved into a world of many, many people, about 40% of the population becoming conspiratorial. And those people are so tied up and twisted with false beliefs and myths, they too are incapable of processing evidence and reason.
Craig,
I told all of this to Jerry Falwell, for example, the late Jerry Falwell, before his death, over a 6-hour lunch in front of the scholars at Liberty University. And at the end of it, he said, "Everything you've said is true. There's not a single point that I would disagree with or could argue with. But I would tell you that if I were to say these things, people would not come to my church, wouldn't fill the charity baskets, would not deliver envelopes to fund my university. And if you say these things, they will label you a kook." My guess is that the vast preponderance of Christian, educated Christians know that what they're promoting is false and that they're doing so for fame and money.
Craig, did it ever occur to you the sheer power of coincidence, that of all the documents to be discovered in a Jordanian cave by a shepherd boy, is this all-encompassing material that you have translated accurately for a change, not your change, but for a change in the caliber of translation? Wow. Imagine it could have been a document on how to feed oxen or something like that. Instead, it cuts to the very gut meat of religion, history, everything at that intersection. Is that
That's correct. Who we are and how we got here. And for example, the most powerful story, past, present, future, is told by the prophet Yahshua, Isaiah. And the entire Yahshua Isaiah scroll is available on the Dead Street. There's not a single word missing. And so we have it in its entirety. And As I said, I just wrote a book on the 10 statements that Yah etched in stone. We have the entirety in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the rendition that was presented in the Badim, Deuteronomy. So these scrolls provide such great access to who God is and what He's offering and what He wants in return.
Our time is almost up. We've got 30 seconds. Can you give us the names of the books?
Yes, I would encourage listeners to start with Yahowah.com. They can also go to questioningpaul.com. They can go to an introduction to God.com. They can go to prophetofdoom.net. Any of these books will lead them to others.
I have met Craig Winn, the most interesting person maybe in the history of the world. Thank you for this hour.